Hello, welcome to the conversation here on News Central Television. This is the program where we bring you up to speed with all the political happenings on the African continent. I'm Gbenga Aborowa. On the program today, we will be looking at the situation in Angola as the Electoral Commission has declared the ruling MPLA as the winner of the presidential elections. This means that President Laurenco is in for a second term. We would also be assessing the political atmosphere in Nigeria as the country prepares for the general elections in 2023. But first, let's begin in Angola, where the governing MPLA party has been declared winner in last week's elections after the Electoral Commission put its vote at 51.17%. But the leader of the main opposition coalition rejected the result. UNITA leader Alberto Costa Jr. rejected what he called brutal discrepancies between the Commission's count and their own tally. He has called for an international commission to review the tally. Fewer than half of Angola's registered voters turned out for last week's Wednesday's elections and obviously gave President João Lourenço a second five-year term and extended the rule of the Marxist People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, or MPLA, which has governed the Southern African oil-producing nation since independence from Portugal in 1975. There are fears that any dispute could ignite violence and keep Alberto Costa Jr. Urged Angolans to keep calm. Now, joining me today on the conversation to discuss all of this and more is Marisa Laurenco. She's a political analyst. She joins in from Johannesburg, South Africa. She specializes in Angola, Mozambique, and South African political issues and economic issues. Warm welcome to you, Marisa. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.
I also have Edmilson Angelo, who is a doctoral researcher, expert in Angolan studies. He joins from the Angolan capital, Luanda. A warm welcome to you, Edmilson.
Thank you very much.
So, Marisa, I'm going to have to break protocol here and start off with Edmilson because he's on the ground in Angola. Now, Edmilson, Angola's National Electoral Commission has announced the final results. The MPLA has won and they will be retaining power. What's the mood like in the country and how are citizens receiving this news?
Right, so it's still very much new. So we got the news about 1 hour and a half ago. So we're still waiting to hear from the political leaders in terms of the opposition. We just heard the first words from the president, obviously Laurenco, who pretty much just said that this is a win, and he has literally clearly said that they were not going to be doing any sort of coalition with any other party in terms of the areas where they lost, whether they're going to be nominating members from the opposition party. But here in Angola, the mood has been calm. I feel like the fact that we obviously right after the election we then had the funeral of the former president. But I think one thing is for sure that this is a win that feels like a loss. And for many people, especially those who voted, they really do feel like they actually they let the voices out in terms of the youth. So even though this is a win for the ruling party, yet now more than ever, people are really sure the power that they had to sort of shake up the whole system that exists in Angola. And everybody's on watch because right now, whether you are MPLA or UNITA, if you do not deliver, definitely the people in Angola are going to ask for it. So the mood still calm. You're still waiting to hear from the opposition party. But overall, the final results reflected the last preliminary results that were published a few days ago. And now it's just a matter of trying to see how the country is going to be governed. Because remember, there are some key areas where the MPLA has lost. And within those areas, they are literally the gate of Angola. That's where everything happens. That's where politics, economics, society, that's pretty much where everything is centered. So we are now waiting to hear what the opposition will say. But so far, I think the results have been well accepted.
Thank you, Edmilson. Let me bring in Marisa Laurenco from Johannesburg, South Africa. I have to say, Marisa is not related to the Angolan president, Laurenco João, in any way. Now, Marisa, the opposition UNITA is disputing the results. How's that likely to play out? What's going to happen next?
So typically, when you do want to challenge the final electoral result, your first avenue is to approach the National Electoral Commission, and this needs to be done within the next, I think, 48 hours. So you will have to go, and it will have to say that it wants to challenge the results. From then on, the National Electoral Commission will have to consider the results, will have to consider the challenge, and then it will decide if it will be taken seriously and if it will move into the Constitutional Court. One concerning thing that has appeared today is we heard Adalberto Costa Jr. say that, if the CNE, the National Electoral Commission, doesn't appoint, a more fair and more transparent team, obviously alluding to the fact that the CNE is partial to the ruling MPLA, he wants to look at external entities. Now, it's not clear what he means by external entities. This is a local issue. We've already seen Portugal say it's a domestic dispute for Angola to sort out. I'm not sure who he would want to get involved, but he did mention something about taking it to the streets. And I think that that's a little bit of a dangerous statement because effectively, you do have formal avenues to challenge the result. Of course, these formal avenues are, very problematic in various ways because, like I said, they are partial to the MPLA. But taking it to the streets, I think, would result in UNITA and Adalberto specifically losing a bit of legitimacy if they look like they want to cause more unrest in this challenge. So it's going to be an interesting, I think, next 3 days to see just how UNITA approaches this.
Yeah, staying with you, Marisa, I mean, there's widespread belief that, the MPLA controls the Angolan Electoral Commission. So you say it won't be the wise thing to protest this elections in the results, that he should go through the proper channels. But these channels are Angolan state-owned channels which are controlled by the MPLA. So what are his chances of seeking redress? And are we sure that these courts will not be biased towards the MPLA?
Look, I absolutely understand what you're saying. It is a very difficult issue because if you do approach the CNE, you do know that they're biased and they're likely to throw it out. It's likely to not even reach the Constitutional Court. But the problem is, if you're UNITA, remember that you're coming from a party that for many, many years, and they've managed to shake off this reputation now, but for many, many years, the MPLA would say voting for UNITA is like asking to go back to the Civil War. And the party has modernized. It has moved away from that. We've seen it capture, the attention of the urban youth. We've seen, the fantastic result that it got in Luanda. But if Adalberto goes ahead and he starts to say, people need to take to the streets and protest, the trouble in Angola is that, and we've seen this in the past, and I can give 2 examples, but when you have people that start protesting about one thing, it quickly boils over into other socioeconomic issues. And that's when you have a real risk of higher social unrest than you might have planned for. So one example is last week, Thursday, we saw a lot of people protesting in the streets of Luanda. And initially, that actually started because one of the other political parties, APN, had not paid people for political party activities. But soon other people joined in and they were protesting against the bias of the CNE. If we look at a major protest that happened in January 2021, this was actually a protest that was started by taxi drivers who were protesting against very strict COVID rules that were impacting their business. And that quickly escalated into civilians actually attacking journalists from state-owned media outlets, saying that they were too biased towards the MPLA, and it resulted in a local MPLA office being torched. So while Adalberto and UNITA, they're in a very tight spot, I think that they have to be very careful with what they do next because of the potential for this to escalate beyond their original complaint. So like I said, a very, very interesting next few days to see how this all plays out.
Thank you, Marisa. Quite a volatile situation there, and there's a propensity, like Marisa said, for things to get out of hand, especially in a place like Angola. Now, Edmilson, UNITA candidate Adalberto Costa Jr. rejected what he called brutal discrepancies between the Commission's count and their own tally. Now, we have a situation where both sides are coming up with 2 results. What's going to happen, and could this lead to post-election violence?
Right. I don't think this could lead to post-election violence, pretty much because I feel like these elections are more than just for political parties. This is really about, especially the Angolan youth. I feel like even for UNITA, it's important for them to also see these as sort of like as a means to the ends of communication for what the youth has been feeling for the past 10 years. It is extremely important to mention that yesterday during the funeral of the former president, we actually heard those first words from Alberto Costa Jr., where he pretty much said, we're gonna remain consistent on our pressure towards the National Electoral Commission. However, we are part of the game, so whatever results come out, we're gonna have to accept it. And like Marisa was saying, it's extremely important for us to remember that for many years, the image of the ruling of the opposition party in Angola used to depend on the narrative of the ruling party. UNITA for Angola was like a synonym of war, of conflict, and that has actually ended. And this election showed that from now on, the power is on UNITA's hand to pretty much direct of how civil society see them. So that's why they have to be extremely careful in terms of how much they're gonna be pressuring towards these results. And it's also important to mention that on the last results presented by UNITA, MPLA was actually winning. And before the final results was actually established or were actually put out today, there was actually counting of the complaints from the opposition parties before the final results were actually counted or was actually published. They actually went through the different areas where the opposition party was complaining. So pretty much right now, I don't think we are seeing signs of any sort of violence. I really do think, like, even for both parties, it's extremely important for them to understand this is more than just these two parties. This is really about how civil society has now find ways for them to, resist the system, for them to put a powerful system on check, for them to really pass a message that, we are the highest voices right now. We don't have any reflections of the war anymore. Our reference is pretty much when Angola was at its peak in terms of economy versus people's everyday life today. So for many of us, especially the youth, they know that they also don't want to be blamed for another generation of people who went to conflict. They really just want to send the message straight that we want to participate within our development. We want to choose the people that want to lead us. We want to pass the message that we need jobs. We don't want just promises. And this is for all the parties. That's why the pressure and the expectations are going to be high, not just for the MPLA, but also for the opposition party, UNITA. So that's why I think perhaps these elections will also mark perhaps the implementation of local elections, because civil society in Angola, now more than ever, they are starting to realize the power that they have, and they're actually starting to utilize that, whether through social media, whether through protests. So this is actually going to be extremely interesting. And I really do believe that through the history of UNITA, this has become a huge win for them. And now that they came together as a group of opposition parties, now we have to find out how they're going to, use the space that they have now conquered in terms of leadership, because these are different personalities. How are they going to deal with it in terms of the assembly? So there are a lot of questions that are going to come out of these elections. But the truth of the matter is, Angolans, they know exactly where they are and where they want to be, especially the youth. And now I don't think political parties are going to have the power to sort of, bring the country into conflict again.
Thank you, Edmilson. Now, Marisa, Edmilson said there's a more vibrant civil society in Angola. He says, even though the UNITA party has lost this one, there's so many gains to take away from this elections. Now, a number of civil society organizations and the opposition have said the Electoral Commission, like I mentioned earlier, and electoral courts are controlled by the ruling MPLA. Is there any truth to this? And if this is the case, then would Angola not remain a one-party state for the foreseeable future? Because it would have to reform internally through the MPLA. Where's the hope for the ordinary Angolans and for the growth of democracy in the country, so we get to a stage where results will be contested in the future?
I think that Angola, it is effectively a one-party state. It's only a democracy in name. But there's only so much time that, these former liberation movements turned dominant ruling parties can stay in power without being challenged, especially if you look at what, the world essentially has gone through. You've had the COVID-19 pandemic. We've got the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It's putting huge pressure on the cost of living. And once that comes into play, people start to turn attention to their governments. And of course, the MPLA is the one in power, and it's the MPLA and it's Laurenco that has to bear the brunt of all of this. I think what we've also seen with civil society is that, of course, it's very repressed in Angola, and to some extent it does self-censor a lot. But a very interesting dynamic has taken place during the Laurenco administration. So when he first came to power in 2017, he promised a departure from the past. He promised to be different from his predecessor, Dos Santos, and he promised to be more open to civil society. And for the first 2 years, there was a lot of hope and a lot of optimism that, he was being different. He actually met with civil society leaders. He met with members of the press. He met with people that had actually been imprisoned by Santos. But by 2019, that hope had faded, and he seemed to be just as repressive as before. But something else has been going along in parallel to this, and that is Angola has been improving its ties to the West. So, for a long time, the MPLA abandoned, its Marxist ideology. It hasn't followed that doctrine. It's more center-right than anything else. But under Laurenco, especially because under Dos Santos, there was a very strong pivot towards China for infrastructure development. But under Laurenco, we've seen a very strong pivot towards the West. And this means, you get greater EU funding for a lot of social development projects. We've seen the help that Angola got from the IMF. We've seen the help that Angola got from the US in developing anti-terrorism financing frameworks.
But it comes with greater scrutiny too when you do business with the West.
Yes, exactly. And this is the thing. So this is why, yes, like you can say, okay, well, the MPLA controls the courts and it controls the National Electoral Commission. And yes, it absolutely does. But it's also being watched more closely than ever before. So if the MPLA wants to interfere, it can only do so to a limited degree because it actually has a lot to lose. It can't just operate unencumbered the way it perhaps used to before. It actually has to contend with the fact that it is being watched and it is being scrutinized. And if the EU and the West don't like what it sees, look, they absolutely want the MPLA to stay in power. They want policy continuity. They don't want an untested government in the form of UNITA. But they also don't want to be seen to be sanctioning widespread rigging and repression. And that is a very difficult balance that the MPLA has had to take care of. And I think that actually they've managed to come out of the elections balancing this quite well, considering the circumstances.
Now, before I go to Edmilson, I want to take you up on something you said earlier, Marisa. You said João Lourenço started as a breath of fresh air and, he looked promising until 2019. What do you think happened? Was it the MPLA machinery or he just changed as an individual or because of the COVID-19 dynamics and what have you? Why did he seem to change?
This was before the COVID-19 pandemic, and essentially it comes about because it's a very normal reason. If the MPLA has to change to become more open, it would basically collapse. It can't survive. The way Dos Santos built up the MPLA was to completely undermine state institutions that are supposed to be democratic, like the National Electoral Commission, the judiciary, and the police. He completely undermined those. Now, if you're going to start giving those more power, and if you're going to start letting civil society be a lot more critical of the government, well, then that means that the MPLA might not win their election. So Laurenco had to make a choice. He had to say, do I want to operate in the best interest of the Angolan state, or do I want to operate in the best interest of the party, and do I want to operate in self-preservation? And of course, he decided to operate with the best interest of the state when it comes to political power. When it comes to economics, especially broad macroeconomic freedoms, he definitely has operated within the interest of the state and not completely in the interest of the MPLA. But when you look at politics, definitely, it's necessary for self-preservation. The MPLA has not been able to rule because it's ruled democratically or because it's ruled fairly. It's ruled, it's had very tight control. Angola has not been a multi-party democracy for very, very long. Dos Santos effectively stepped down after 2 years in power after he changed the constitution, but we know he had been ruling for decades before that. If Laurenco is making too many changes, the MPLA cannot survive those. It cannot survive in an open and critical society. And that was effectively the choice that he was faced with. And then what we actually saw is this shift happened from 2019. And in 2020, with the COVID-19 pandemic, he actually then re-centralized power, which, it's already quite a centralized presidency, but he actually tightened his circle even more, because whenever a government is facing a crisis, whether it's internal or external, that's what it needs to do to survive. And that's essentially what has happened with Laurenco and the MPLA. And this is not unique to Angola. This is unique to many, many liberation parties. They struggle to operate, I would say, within the Southern Africa region. The one key exception is South Africa. But if you look at SWAPO, if you look at the ZANU-PF, for example, they don't know how to open ranks. They don't know how to operate in a democracy. And if you look at Zimbabwe, the clock is essentially reset, on its post-colonial shift. If we look at Mozambique, when Frelimo suddenly actually increased its vote share in 2019, we're seeing these political parties not knowing how to operate in a more democratic space and not knowing how to open ranks. And that's exactly what we've seen the MPLA go through. Of course, these dynamics are shifting because, again, the MPLA has got a lot to lose if it rigs too blatantly or if, it represses too much. But essentially, it cannot be open because it will threaten its very survival and essentially push itself out of power.
Thank you, Marisa. Now, Edmilson, this this is the fourth election since multi-party elections returned to Angola. What would you say, how has this election been different from previous elections in Angola, in your own opinion? What are the positives, and in what areas can the Electoral Commission, CNA, improve on for future elections?
Right. The first takeaway from it is perhaps people's participation in it. When I mean participation in it, I give emphasis to the digital space. I think these elections are going to mark the solidification of the digital space within state-citizen relationship in Angola. Definitely, people have now found within the digital space a means of communication, a means of counter disinformation, a means of resistance. So definitely, social media has now become and will become from now on a huge instrument for how the relationship between the people governed and those who are governed. Another element, obviously, is the youth, and this is a different type of youth. This is a youth that is more connected with the digital space. This is a youth that has no memories of the past. This is a youth that has gone out and has, proudly said that I have voted for X or Y, and this is also something extremely different. Another element is the fact that, I think the message was extremely, it was extremely loud in terms of people who voted, because for many years, people always saw Angolan community or Angolan civil society as one that is very passive, as one that never delivers when it's time to deliver. And for us, that has been following up for the past 5 years, when the civil society were coming up with hashtags, already letting the government know that, look, if you do not change in 2022, you will see it. And actually they delivered, and people are happy to see that actually, the whole system was actually put on check. And I feel like even for the MPLA, it's now time to rethink, because what they try to do is the spaces that they try to open to show that they are more democratic, that they are closer to public, actually resulting in an open space within civil society where, because of the way in which the system operates, they don't have sort of like expertise, and the adaptation within the digital space is way too long. While on the other side, the opposition part, they actually been on these spaces where the youth are for the past 5 years. They have been creating this momentum with civil society. They've been speaking the language of the youth. So they actually managed to become someone that the youth saw it as representation. But I think for the MPLA, there's a lot of takeaways in here. It was really a shame to see the youth body of the MPLA literally disappear in a moment where the country is really being ruled by young people. So there's a lot of things that we are waiting to see how things are gonna be taking place. But there's a lot to take away from it. Is the fact that even people in the diaspora have voted for the first time, and many people think that the votes don't really matter. But in terms of just having a simple impact, is extremely important, because these voices from the diaspora, they sort of maximizes the voices that are in Angola. So it was really interesting to see how much, when the counting was happening, how much people were sharing on WhatsApp, and the system couldn't understand what's going on. So that's why I feel like the digital space is perhaps the most, the biggest takeaway from this election. And now I think in terms of even watching, and that's why it's extremely hard for the MPLA to do any sort of rig right now, or at least one that is very visible, is the fact that besides the international community, it really is civil society who are watching. It's groups within civil society who are doing the job of the commission. There are WhatsApp groups. There's so many things within Angola happening that sort of put pressure on the system to have a smaller space to maneuver. But I really do think that this has been an election that has been historic. I think if you look at the past elections, perhaps the ones that have more similarities is the first one in 1992, just on the way things were going, even in terms of the differentiation, of the difference between the results. So there's a lot of takeaway, and that's why I really do believe that this is actually the end of a page within Angolan history. And I think we're now going to be opening a new page in terms of how the country is ruled.
Quite an optimistic outlook from you, Edmilson. Now, Marisa, before we leave, we won't do justice if we don't talk about the legacy of this man that towered over Angolan politics for 38 years. I'm talking about Jose Eduardo dos Santos, who was laid to rest in Luanda on what would have been his 80th birthday. During his campaign, President Laurenco asked Angolans to vote MPLA to honor his legacy. What was this legacy, and how soon do you see Angola moving beyond the Dos Santos years? Because it feels not a lot has changed.
So when Laurenco was speaking about honoring Dos Santos' legacy, Dos Santos has this reputation of being the architect of peace. And that was just because, when the Civil War was raging in essentially 3 phases from independence until 2002, it was sort of seen that UNITA was responsible for that. And this is a the kind of thought and the legacy that the MPLA has, promoted itself on, the fact that, it was only with the death of the Unita leader, Jonas Savimbi, that essentially Angola could actually move into peace and the civil war could actually be over. But something very interesting has happened with Dos Santos' legacy and his memory since Laurenco took office in 2017. And that has been, Laurenco promised a clear departure from his predecessor, and while he hasn't entirely delivered on it, especially when it does come to repression of civil society, like we've discussed, he's quietly renamed things, like buildings and streets that were named after Dos Santos. And I think that when Dos Santos' death happened, Laurenco was in a little bit of a dilemma because he thought, okay, I have to obviously acknowledge my predecessor. You have to, capitalize on the fact that, we can reposition the MPLA as, the savior of the Angolan state, first from colonialism and first from the Civil War. But on the other hand, he didn't really want to draw too much attention to the predecessor that effectively had called corrupt and said, hadn't really run Angola that well. I do think there is a little bit of nostalgia for Dos Santos that is not necessarily, coming from people remembering his rule with fondness, but I think that Angola is going through very, very tough economic times. And especially if you look at the Dos Santos family, which with its control over the business landscape, and especially Isabel Dos Santos, since the Luanda leaks came out that implicated her in so many corruption scandals, like a major supermarket chain closed down, and that resulted in a loss of jobs. So you've got a lot of Angolans saying, oh, well, maybe things are better under Dos Santos, but they're not really taking into account the fact, well, Isabel Dos Santos was very corrupt, so maybe she was providing, some people with some jobs, but that wasn't really enough. And then again, Laurenco has presided over a very, very difficult time in the Angolan economy. And then, of course, he was hit by the COVID-19 pandemic and now the Russian-Ukraine conflict. So I think, there's a little bit of a mixed legacy for Dos Santos. And I think there is a little bit of nostalgia that creeps in. But I do think that Angola has steadily started to move away from that. The MPLA itself is in a new era, and they had to draw attention to Dos Santos. Of course, you have to pay respect, especially to such a prominent liberation leader on the continent, but I don't think that he really has the kind of prominence that he did command before.
Okay. Thank you very much, Marisa, Laurenco, and Edmilson. Angelo, thank you very much for being a part of the conversation today. I do appreciate your insights and contribution to the program.
Thanks very much.
You're watching The Conversation on News Central Television. We'll go on a quick break, and when we return, we will be looking at the political situation in Nigeria as the country inches towards the 2023 general elections. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.